Welcome back to Crimson Cast. Galen Clavio joining you. Recording this the morning of Thursday, November 21st. We're recording a bunch of these shows, but we're basically releasing them all out of order. So I have no idea when you folks are hearing this or watching this. All I know is that the music's playing again for reasons I can't adequately. There we go. Let's turn it off. Tech issues all morning. It's snowing outside. For those of you who know my feelings on November, this is why those feelings exist, as it's pretty brutal outside here in Bloomington this morning. But it's going to warm up in Columbus this weekend, and there's a huge football game, and we're excited to have Stefan Krajisnik from Cleveland.com joining us here on the show. Stefan, hi, good to see you. Welcome to the show. I think maybe for the first time.
I think so, unless I'm trying to think back of when it may have happened. I think this is the first time. So for long-time listener, first-time caller.
Well, good to have you on. I think we have to lead this off before we get to the home field read by asking, have they discovered your true identity yet in Columbus?
I've been asked about my feelings about this game a lot. Let's just say that. For those who don't know, I cover Ohio State for Cleveland.com, but I graduated from Indiana in 2021, so I am a disciple of the Galen Clavio Media School.
That's right, the Galen Clavio Media School, right? Yes, Stefan is one of ours, as we would like to say here in Hoosier land. So we're really happy to have him joining us here on the show. Let's talk a little bit about Home Field Apparel first and foremost, the presenting sponsor of the Back Home Network and the place to go for the finest in college fashions, the softest fabrics, the coolest designs. Stefan, we know Home Field here in Bloomington. I'm curious, you've been covering the Ohio State, fan base here for the year. How much Home Field have you seen across that fan base?
Oh yeah, I think it's starting to become a thing that our little IU secret at first is no longer such. People around the Big Ten, and before Ohio State, I covered Mississippi State, and they love Home Field down there as well. You know, they did the baseball jersey release for Mississippi State. I know that was a big thing. So all over. College football, all over college athletics, even the SEC that we have opinions about this week in particular. They also love Home Field. We can hand in hand on that, I guess.
Yes, we're all it's weird because Home Field is the great uniter, and SEC folks love them too, as they should. And they have you completely outfitted and ready to go for this type of weather out here. You want hoodies? They got them. Crew necks. They got jackets. Whatever you need. Go to homefieldapparel.com, use the code HOME23, get 15% off your first order, and follow them on the socials. They have great specials. They'll have random, big days off in terms of percentage off on the store, including right around now. Like, there's a Cyber Monday, Black Friday sale. I can never remember which one it is, but Home Field will be in on that. So go follow them on the socials and use the code HOME23 if you haven't shopped there before and get 15% off your first order. All right. Well, Steph, let's just start right in on this. Indiana ranked 5th, Ohio State ranked 2nd. Biggest game certainly in recent memory in Indiana regular season football history. And for Ohio State, it's an important game, but it's just another game. I mean, they play these types of games all the time. That, from a mentality perspective, at least in terms of how people are perceiving this game, I think is an interesting one. How much of that do you think is true? This is an older Ohio State team. It's an Ohio State team that has come up short a couple of years in a row now in terms of where they want to be in the pecking order, not just the Big Ten, but in college football. And this has been an interesting season in that they've pretty much dominated everybody that they've played except for Penn State, who they eased past, I would say. And then, of course, the Oregon game where they come up short. This is the other tough game on their schedule. No one thought it would be at the beginning of the year, but what would you describe as the overall mentality of Ohio State coming into this one?
Yeah, it's crazy. Just, a stat I saw from Ross Dellinger earlier this week that this is the 3rd top 5 game that Ohio State is playing this season. This is the first ever top 5 game for Indiana football. To kind of put into context, not just, what this game means for Indiana, but just the history of these two programs. It could not be more polar opposites, right? Yeah. And I think that is an important part of this game. Of you have an Ohio State team that most of the roster and I'm not even just talking about this year, I'm talking about the last few years, has experience in these games. They know these games, whether they be home or on the road. They know everything that surrounds a matchup like this. They've been, twice on the road this year where game day's been there, the Oregon and the Penn State games, as you mentioned. So they understand all of that. I will say from Indiana's perspective, it's probably a bit I don't know if I'd call it a cloud, but it's just this bigger thing hovering over of your program has never played in this caliber of a game, right? Like the Michigan game last 2 weeks ago was massive. The Nebraska game was massive. I think you, Scott, referred to it like you talked about the Nebraska game was like the biggest in program history. And then Scott was like, well, so is the next one. And then the next one. And then the next one. Like we've gotten to that point with Indiana, which is fascinating. So I do think there's an element of, IU's players also being comfortable somewhat in this type of environment, but it's different, man. It's going to be a test for IU, maybe more so than Ohio State. Because you look at even some of the new guys that came to Ohio State, and Caleb Downs transfers from Alabama. I mean, they were playing in college football playoff. He has experience in that. Quinshon Judkins was at Ole Miss. They were playing in ranked games all the time last season. So I think that's probably an area where Ohio State has the edge, just experience in games like this. But you can't discount, what every week has felt like for Indiana. There is probably some element to that for Indiana where it's like, I mean, yeah, we haven't historically been doing this, but it's something that's felt like we've been doing the last, 4 weeks in a row.
Yeah. I mean, everything's relative. And obviously, if you're Indiana, you're accruing these challenges. It's like a video game. It's like you're passing through each boss level to get to the next one. This is kind of a final boss level sort of environment. And yet, there's two ways to look at it. And I think it was Jake Butt that I heard talking about this on BTN, where it's like you could either say we're going to shrink from the moment because we haven't been in that moment before and it's going to overwhelm. Or it could be, hey, we got nothing to lose here. We can go out and play free. Ohio State has as much to lose, if not slightly more, than Indiana in this game. And you've proven in your minds, at least, if you're Indiana, that you belong. And, that you've dominated so many opponents. You had a tough game against Michigan, a team that's always had your number, and you're able to come out on top in that one. So, and this is the thing that both makes this game really intriguing and really exciting to get ready for, and also impossible to predict because, as we'll get into in a minute, the stats with these two teams are very similar. And it's been interesting watching people waking up around the country and saying, oh, actually, these teams are both really good in all three phases of the game. But we don't know how Indiana is going to react in the moment of being in the horseshoe and playing an Ohio State team that has been there before. Yeah. It feels like we always talk about these things. We rarely really follow up on them in our own minds in terms of like how it went. So I'm really curious to see how Indiana weathers that and how Curt Cignetti and his staff choose to get their team ready for this type of a challenge.
Well, I think what's exciting about this team in particular compared to Indiana teams, at least in recent memory, but probably throughout most of the program's history, is that we talk about this team having, or at least playing with nothing to lose, right? Play loose. And this team has shown that it can do that, right? They're not afraid to air it out when they need to air it out. They're not afraid to take some shots. And if it doesn't pay off, then, so be it. At least you took the shot. I can't get that game last year, the game at Penn State, out of my mind of just like, it's such a big game and you're playing so conservative and you're playing not to lose. And it's so refreshing, I think, for Indiana fans to see this year's team and be like, they're playing to win. They are not playing to not lose. And I think that's something that factors into this game where, even if Indiana falls behind in this game, right? Like it's a 14-point spread. People think it'll be a game that's decided by a couple of possessions. I mean, even if Indiana falls behind, this doesn't feel like the IU team in the past that would just kind of, roll away and it was over if they were down 14-0. I think that's what gives people a lot of confidence is that regardless of what this game looks like early on, you have a coaching staff that's willing to take some shots and take some chances and not play conservatively.
It's funny because I was watching some highlights of the Michigan game this morning, just trying to get myself back fully into the vibe of IU football after a week off. And
vibe's still good?
Vibe's still good. Vibe check was positive. But it was interesting watching that and seeing the number of times Indiana went for it on fourth down. And it reminded me of exactly what you were just talking about. This idea that IU has really taken it to their opponents, and they haven't let their opponents feel safe. And I think drawing that contrast between like the Tom Allen era IU teams, who were always, it felt like, trying to preserve just enough space that they might be able to sneak the victory. Whereas Cignetti's been like, no, we're going to be on the front foot. And it's interesting there because it does negatively affect the other team's decision-making process, because then they feel like they've got to start going for it, and they don't often get the fourth down conversions, or they're taking shots earlier in downs than they should, and then they're behind. And, so that aggressiveness really does work, and particularly with the team that Indiana's got, because they have players that can execute and then have executed throughout the course of the season in those circumstances. The one thing that I'm really interested in from your perspective, you've watched every game that this Ohio State team has played, and they're clearly a great, talented team. They've done a tremendous job, especially defensively, throughout most of the season. But as I was talking about in the preview with Taylor, which you have not heard yet, but you'll hear sometime later today, if you look at their schedule, they've really only had 3 tough games, and they happened all in a row. They had Oregon, which they lost, and they gave up 32 points in that game. Nebraska really tested them for most of the game. It was a lower scoring game, 21-17. And then, of course, Penn State on the road, they allow 13 points in that game. The rest of their wins and where they've accrued most of their statistical advantages have been against teams that just haven't been able to compete. The 3 MAC teams or whatever. Marshall's not in the MAC, but they might as well be. And then, Michigan State, Iowa, Purdue, Northwestern, not exactly a murderer's row of teams in the conference. So as much as Indiana's gotten criticized for not playing a tough schedule, a lot of Ohio State's statistical dominance has kind of been racked up against those types of teams. And I keep looking at Indiana, and I say, if I look at everybody's profile that Ohio State's played, they're more similar to Oregon than they are to the other teams that Ohio State's played. And that makes for an interesting. Are you still
there? Yep, I'm here. I lost you there for a second, but I got what you were saying about
profound point. What
I thought I'd just leave it at that.
Exactly. But no, all I'm saying, I guess, is that from the standpoint of what Indiana brings into the game, they feel offensively at least more like Oregon than the other teams Ohio State's played. And I'm curious if the dominance on defense for Ohio State is really dominance on defense, or if it's a matter of teams not being able to exploit Ohio State in a lot of the games that they've played.
That's been the huge talking point this week, right? This is the first time we're going to see a team of, at least offensively, of close to Oregon's caliber go against Ohio State. The Penn State game, and you mentioned 13 points allowed. I mean, 7 of those were on a pick 6. So the defense, but that was a big result of Penn State doesn't have the receivers of an Oregon, and not even the receivers of an Indiana. And I think Indiana's receivers have proven to be up there, on par, at least in production, like Oregon's. Maybe they don't have the NFL draft talent or anything like that, but this is going to be the test that everyone's kind of been waiting for. Initially, we thought, okay, let's see what adjustments Ohio State's defense makes for that rematch with Oregon in the Big Ten title game. And I mean, now you look at Indiana's numbers, you're like, well, here's the rematch that we're looking for. The matchup with Indiana is the one we've been waiting for, because that Oregon game was the first time the corners for Ohio State were really exposed. And this is the game where we're going to find out, was that a fluke? Because Davison Igbinosun and Denzel Burke were both guys coming into this year who we thought were surefire, probably early draft picks, maybe even competing for a first-round pick. Mel Kiper came out with his, big boards and things like that a week ago, and neither of those corners were top 10 corners on the big board, let alone, overall players on the big board. So Oregon exposed some things, taking some deep shots, going over the top of those guys. And, the back shoulder stuff that IU does is a concern for some in Ohio State land, because Ohio State's corners have not been particularly great defending it. Like, I think about Surratt and some of those back shoulder passes he's caught. We've seen Ohio State struggle to defend those at times. Yeah. So that's one aspect of it. What's different about this game, though, compared to Oregon, is that Oregon game was kind of a wake-up call for Ryan Day and his defensive staff about the way they operate. So much so that, people who don't know the background of Ohio State, Chip Kelly's the offensive coordinator now. Throughout his tenure, Ryan Day was the play caller on offense. He handed that over this past offseason. And a big part of it was the things that head coaches have to deal with now in college football is quite overwhelming. And I think having someone call plays and design plays and things like that is probably smart, especially if it can be, Chip Kelly, a Big Ten head coach that you can take to be an offensive coordinator. So as Ryan Day has kind of stepped away, he's been a bit more involved with the defense. And after that Oregon game, he was heavily involved in some of those defensive meetings about changing things. Nick Saban called their defensive front an antiquated front because it was just a 4-man rush and they were getting no pressure. They have all the 5 stars on the defensive line, right? So you're thinking coming into the season, you can live 4-man rush because you're going to get pressure like that. Well, they weren't. And Oregon was just sitting, Dylan Gabriel was just sitting there throwing the ball all over the place, doing whatever he wanted with the time that he had in the pocket. They changed that a bit. The linebackers are getting a lot more involved in the pass rush. Caleb Downs and Lathan Ransom, their safeties, are getting a bit more involved in the pass rush. And we've seen improvement. Now, obviously, that improvement was against Penn State, Purdue, Northwestern, not exactly the best offenses, but we've seen them at least, adjust and do some different things. And this is kind of the first test of that. What is this new-ish Ohio State defense going to look like against one of the best offenses in the country? And that's, I think, the most exciting part of this game is seeing those two sides go at it and see which side prevails.
Yeah, it's really interesting, especially since you've got Ohio State, which made some changes since that game, like you said. But you've also got Indiana, who's had two interesting things, I think, coming into this game. They played probably their worst offensive game against Michigan. And, especially that second half. But they've had a couple of periods now of bad offense. I mean, they struggled offensively in the second half against Washington. A lot of that was Rourke being out. They struggled in the first quarter offensively against Michigan State. And then they struggle in the last 2 quarters offensively against Michigan. That can't sit well with Curt Cignetti and Mike Shanahan and that staff. Like that's been a point of pride of them all season, their ability to move the ball through the air. But then you've also had an extra week to prepare. Indiana's had a chance to kind of pull back, see what they're doing wrong, but also look at these changes that Ohio State has put in. And to me, that's probably the most intriguing chess match of the whole thing is like, how does Indiana structure their approach? What do they change? What have they left in the bag that they haven't pulled out yet this season? And how do they reintegrate like Elijah Surratt into the passing game? He's really struggled the last couple of games. Obviously had the great touchdown catch against Michigan, but that masked a couple of really big drops and a lot of coverage that he couldn't get out of from Michigan. So just a lot of those sorts of items that, again, we don't know. And it's funny the way this game works because like you've had this extra time for both teams essentially to get ready because neither Purdue nor Northwestern was that big of a challenge for Ohio State. They were able to just kind of try things out the way they wanted to. And we've yet to see Curt Cignetti and his staff go up against this caliber of an opponent, but it's not like Ohio State is necessarily a world beater in the passing game. And that is going to be a really interesting thing to think about defensively for them.
Yeah, no doubt. It's going to be a big test for these corners. We're going to find out, if that Oregon game was more of a fluke or if that's something to keep an eye on. Denzel Burke was the corner who kind of got burned more so than the other corners. But Davison Igbinosun, if he's not the top in the country in terms of defensive holding and pass interference calls, so I wouldn't be surprised if you see IU take some shots his way where maybe Rourke throws it and you're like, what does he see there? And it's like, well, we're just going to throw in that direction because we might be able to get a PI or holding. And it's a smart thing to do when the numbers are backing it up.
On the other side of the ball, Ohio State has been good offensively, but again they've been playing a lot of defenses that have just not been able to match up against the skill players that Ohio State's had. Obviously, the big news this week, another injury on the offensive line at the center position. Maybe it's not the complete disaster that it might be otherwise, since they're able to replace him with a center that played last year for Ohio State. Yeah. So you've always got somebody who knows that position and has played it, on this team before. But given the increased effectiveness of the IU defensive line, and the way CJ West is playing, the way Mikael Kamara has been playing, Ohio State's focused on trying to get the run game established. That's something that Michigan couldn't do. I'm curious to see if Ohio State is like, we're not going to run at the teeth of this. We need to throw around it. And then if Indiana is in that position, how they're able to pressure Will Howard in the passing game. There's just a lot of individual chess pieces that are going to get moved around within this.
Yeah, no doubt. And Chip Kelly has been pretty persistent about establishing the run. So it is interesting. Is this a game where he maybe goes against that and lets the pass kind of establish the run for them just because of those reasons that you mentioned? The offensive line, man, it's been quite an adventure watching it this year, just because they were the most, I guess, criticized unit going into the season, because the way they closed out last year was not promising. Their recruiting, for as great as Ohio State's recruiting is, has not been great across the offensive line, right? They're not, they don't have a million 5-stars along the offensive line, or just sitting in the background, waiting to step in like maybe we see at some other positions. And losing Seth McLaughlin at center is not huge, because you mentioned you have your left guard was your starting center last year. You went 11-1 in the regular season with him. He's obviously a very fine candidate there, and he's been working behind Seth McLaughlin, because this is where it kind of becomes a bit of a circus. So stay with me here. Ohio State's left tackle, Josh Simmons, potentially a first-round pick, goes down with a season-ending knee injury the Oregon game. They get a bye week. 2 weeks later, they play Nebraska. Their backup left tackle, he goes down with an injury. We haven't seen him since. Ryan Day made it sound like he's not going to be back, available this week. So they're now 2 left tackles, arguably the most important position outside of quarterback on a football team. The left guard, Donovan Jackson, who was one of those highly recruited guards, he was actually recruited as a tackle, has been more of a guard. Now he's at left tackle. So your left guard is now your starting left tackle. And he's actually been pretty fine. So at left guard, you put in your backup center because he's got some experience. He's played the interior. Put him in there. Okay. So now your center goes down with the season-ending injury. So now your left guard, who was the backup center, is now the center. And now you have to figure it out at left guard. And this is where it's all becoming a little bit interesting, because sure, Donovan Jackson moving to left tackle, he's looked pretty good, looked the part. But that's because next to him, he had an experienced guy who's played some big snaps in Big Ten football. Now, your left guard is a question mark. And how much safety does that add now for your left tackle, who maybe is a little bit more of a question mark than we thought? It all gets a little bit jumbled, right? The more you rotate, the more, sure, it doesn't look disastrous. It's not as bad as it could be. It's not as bad as if you lost another left tackle. But there is this rotating wheel now where you're like, there's a bit of a domino effect. And how much does that affect the right side of the line now? Because left side's getting bombarded. Does IU maybe throw some things at the right side to try to test them as well? So as much as we say IU's receivers are going to be a test, yeah, this IU defensive line is going to be a test. And establishing the running game, it's going to be interesting to see how Chip Kelly approaches that.
Well, and this was, again, it's something we mentioned with Taylor. It's like it's not necessarily just the snap counts for the linemen. It's the repetitions together. Mm-hmm. And it's that chemistry that builds. And we've seen this with Indiana. Like they lose their left guard and they weren't nearly as effective at times. They actually ended up playing better than I think people thought they did in the Michigan game. But if we're able to keep that group together, they're able to play collectively better than any of them that could play individually. And that much change, especially in the middle of the week. I mean, this is the big thing. It's not like this happened 2 weeks ago and Ohio State had a bunch of time to get people comfortable with each other. They're going to kind of be doing this live, and that's going to be interesting to watch. And yeah, I'm fascinated really to see what Brian Haynes decides to dial up in this, because if you can plug the run and get Ohio State into long downs, that plays right into Indiana's approach, because what you really don't want to do, Indiana's defensive backs are physically not at the same level as Ohio State's wide receivers. So how do you mitigate that? Well, you don't put your defensive backs on an island. You've got to have help out there. You got to have an extra defensive back, or you got to be able to bring people over. But you've also got to get pressure on Will Howard. And Will Howard hasn't dealt with pressure that well this season when he's seen it. Mm-hmm. Not that many teams have been able to consistently get it. Indiana feels like the type of team that could. And again, go back and watch the Michigan game. Indiana was dialing up a lot of delayed blitzes, from members of the secondary. They were doing a lot of stunting. They were doing a lot of things to disguise their front, which is another thing that, if it's the running game, Indiana's dialed in. But in the passing game, Ohio State's got to figure all that out on the fly as well. And I think there's a potential mismatch there for Indiana to exploit.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, when you think about, creating pressure, you immediately think about, defensive line, maybe linebackers. It's going to be a test for these corners. Can a big reason Will Howard hasn't been pressured a ton is because they get the ball out pretty quick, right? I mean, these receivers get open pretty quick. You get them the ball, all that good stuff. can these corners be a bit more aggressive at the line, maybe, and maybe delay it for a second, give that defensive line an extra second that a lot of teams haven't been able to give their defensive lines to get to Will Howard. I think it's a huge part of this game to watch.
Something I'm interested in, like I think perhaps the most shocking thing for Indiana in the Michigan game was their defensive line, you could argue, out-physicaled Michigan's offensive line.
Oh, yeah.
It seems like almost sacrilegious to suggest that that could happen here. But as you've mentioned, like this is not a 5-star across-the-board offensive line for Ohio State. I am really fascinated because I think if I think about the things that distinguish this Indiana from previous vintages of Indiana, it's really two things. It's like the preparation and the attention to detail is one bucket, but the physicality is the other. And it's grown so much over the course of this season. Like this defense is far more physical and far more after it now than they were, say, in the Maryland game or the Northwestern game. And I don't know that Ohio State players mentally would be necessarily prepared to deal with an Indiana that's actually able to punch back. They're so used in these games to just grinding their opponents down and not getting hit back. And it feels like the 1 or 2 times that happened this year, or the 3 times really, were the 3 games that were close for them. The Nebraska game in particular, it felt like Nebraska was able to go toe-to-toe with them from a physical perspective. So I am curious to see how that plays out. Obviously, Indiana's got to bring it, but I think they've at least got a chance at bringing it, which is far more than I would normally say for Indiana in this situation.
100%. You know, remember that Nebraska game was the week after everyone declared Nebraska sucked.
Yes.
So that was quite the revelation for a lot of people to see Nebraska compete on the road with a top 2 team. But yeah, this is where IU is so different. The defensive line the production has been crazy. It's gone from this point of like, oh, they're doing some good things against some lower opponents to like, okay, you can't ignore what this defensive line is doing, even if they don't have maybe the stars that some other teams do. I mean, it just like, you look at Kamara's numbers by itself, and that tells you everything. Like how often does IU have a guy who's at the top of the Big Ten standings in sacks, and it's not Ohio State? I mean, think about the Bosas and Chase Young and things of that nature. Like Kamara's putting up numbers that are atop the Big Ten, and I think that kind of sets the tone for a lot of things. And if he's a big focus for this Ohio State offensive line, right? Because they're probably going to need guys to help each other out a bit, right? I don't know how often you're going to want to go one-on-one with him. It's going to create some havoc on other sides of the line with other guys getting opportunities. And that's what's exciting is not only is this line good, but it's deep as well, right? They've got options of guys who could make life tough for Will Howard in this running game even. So I think that's an exciting part of this matchup it does feel like the first time, maybe in quite a while, that IU in the trenches, or at least between IU's defensive front and Ohio State's offensive line, there's a chance to be on a pretty level playing field here.
Yeah. What does Indiana need to do to try to, like, when I look at Ohio State, one of the big factors in this game is obviously the crowd. It's been interesting watching Ryan Day and the Ohio State blogs, like imploring the crowd, like make this as loud as possible. Whenever you have to do that, it's not going to happen. I think that's kind of a truism in life. Like if you have to ask someone to do something along those lines, it's probably not going to happen. So what does Indiana have to do to try to take the crowd out of this game? It feels to me like, interestingly, for their reputation of being a fast starting team, Indiana hasn't started fast the last few games, at least not offensively. Is that imperative for Indiana to do in this game? Like, do they need to score in their first couple of possessions if they want to harbor any hopes of winning this one?
Yeah, I think it would be a big part of it is get out to a hot start. You see it a lot on teams that pull off upsets on the road is that's a big part of it. Another thing is just it sounds so cliche, but it's going to be cold. If you could muddy up this game a little bit, and I know as fun as IU's offense has been at times, like if they can establish a running game and make this game ugly, I think that's what Nebraska did a good job of keeping the crowd out of it, of just fans came into it thinking, all right, like Nebraska just lost by 50, Ohio State's going to cruise. And Nebraska just kept punching back and making it ugly and forcing 3-and-outs and forcing punts and things of that nature that it got to the fourth quarter and people were just kind of uneasy and kind of ticked off. And that's the goal whenever you're playing these Bamas and Georgias and Ohio States of their fans have an expectation of beating the crap out of you. And the moment they're not, and it's like the fourth quarter and it's still a close game, some of these fans get frustrated more so than into it. Like Indiana, I think about the Michigan game, I think the tighter that got, the more that you saw that crowd get into it and make it a difference. Whereas we see maybe some of these bigger spots where if you get into the fourth quarter is tight, they start getting a little bit mad with their own team as opposed to, making an environment against the other team. So I'm sure Ohio Stadium is going to be loud. There's going to be, well over 100,000 people there. It's going to be a tough environment. But can you continue, like you said, to punch back and make it ugly and make the fans frustrated more so than kind of into it? I think would play into Indiana's favor here.
Yeah. You mentioned the weather. Let's talk about that a little bit. So it doesn't look as bad as it did when the week started. Like when the week started, it was like, that's going to be really cold and the winds are going to be real bad. But now, so I'm looking at the AccuWeather forecast, which I would hope would be accurate. If not, guys, we got to talk about the name. But now, 47 for a forecasted high with a real feel of 46. Wind, which like at one point the gusts were projected to be around 30 miles an hour. Now they're saying wind west-southwest at 7 miles an hour, gusting to 13. Maybe not as cloudy as we thought it was going to be. I mean, there's two schools of thought in this game, it feels like, from the people that I've talked to. One of them is the school of thought that you want to muddy the game up if you're Indiana. The other school of thought is you want to press Ohio State in the passing game. You want to throw the ball all over the field. It's a lot easier to do that in these sorts of conditions than the ones that originally were expected. If those are indeed the conditions, as we talk about this 48 hours from the game, who does that favor, in your opinion?
I don't know if it favors anyone. I think it kind of just leaves it as a level playing field. I think if it had been, like you said, windier, and I think that there were even some projections of snow, I think that would have played into Ohio State's favor, since I think their running game is better, and if they have to lean on it, I think I trust them a bit more in the running game, even with a bit of a banged up offensive line. These running backs are both potential first round picks. They're pretty dang good. So originally I was thinking, okay, this could maybe play into Ohio State's favor. Now I'm thinking it's pretty level. If Indiana can throw the ball the way that we've seen them throw the ball, and the weather's not a factor, I think they could play their game, and Ohio State with their RPO game and whatever they want to do there, whether it be run more or pass more, I think plays into their favor as well. So I'm not really sure if the weather changes a whole lot now that it's kind of cleared up a bit.
And obviously it could change again, but we'll see. Yeah, I don't know.
It favors Big Ten schools. I know that. I mean, it was. Did you see it was a balmy 55 for Georgia, Tennessee?
Yeah, the heaters were out and the receivers couldn't catch the ball. This is the environment the SEC is really worried about in the playoff, like having to go to Bloomington or Columbus or Happy Valley for games like
Bend, yeah.
Yeah, you know what? It's funny. It's a conversation we've never had to have in college football, but we've always talked about it in the NFL, where you got your Miamis or your Chargers or whomever. They're playing outdoors. It's sunshiny outside, and then you got to go to, Cleveland or Chicago. Well, not Chicago, Green Bay.
All right.
Yeah, I'm kidding.
That was unnecessary.
But you got to go and play in the cold, and it's like not fun. This is not fun at all. But that's neither here nor there. Both of these teams, I think this is their first potentially cold weather game. So neither team really has an advantage per se with that. But I will be interested to see how hard the winds are blowing and whether there's any precipitation. It doesn't look like there's going to be. I guess the last thing I'll ask you as we go into this, I mean, from an atmosphere perspective, what's been the buildup in Columbus and around Ohio State in terms of the discourse on this game? It feels different. Like normally it's dismissive, and it hasn't felt dismissive, but it feels like it's more Ohio State people worried about themselves than necessarily worried about Indiana per se. Does that match what you've been seeing?
Yeah, I think the big reason you're seeing kind of this push of, pack Ohio Stadium and make it loud is this is the 5th of 6 straight noon games to close out the season. Ohio State fans are not thrilled with big noon, kind of like we saw with Penn State earlier this year. So I think that amidst all this kind of complaining about another noon kickoff, I think Ohio State's kind of trying to make a push of like, hey, we understand this is not the best situation for fans who want to tailgate and things like that, but like this is a top 5 matchup. So can you please, like, let's put the anger aside and we'll deal with that in the offseason about kickoff times and things like that. The buildup has been odd because Michigan is next week. And right. I think that's when you kind of see the all-out nature of it. And it's almost like it almost felt like on Tuesday, Ryan Day had to kind of remind everyone that, this is a top 5 matchup and let's treat it as such. And I think a lot of that is due to national media, maybe more so than Ohio State, because I opened Twitter earlier today and I saw that Indiana already lost by 30. So
Oh,
I'm not really sure why they're playing this game if it's already been decided.
I heard they were, yeah. Well, I heard they were supposed to forfeit, right? Wasn't that something
That's
else?
right. That's right. And what? By the way, do you have any update for me on Curtis Rourke and if they're electing to bench him?
They haven't specifically said, so I think we have to entertain the possibility that he might not play. This might be Tyler Cherry's debut. You know, you don't even want to risk your backup in this case.
I'm gonna text Zach Oster and be like, you didn't ask the hard hitting question of are you gonna bench your starting quarterback who's maybe gonna listen, if IU pulls this off, we've been talking about it all week. Rourke's in the Heisman conversation.
Yeah.
He already kind of is, but if they pull it off, like that's the moment that people talk about.
And I feel like for them to win the game, he's going to have a Heisman caliber performance. You know, I mean, I'm talking about 3+ touchdown passes and, you know, probably over 300 yards passing in the game. I mean, you know, I don't see a scenario where maybe there's a scenario where Indiana's able to really run the ball consistently against this Ohio State defense. You know, maybe they figure out some things there, or maybe Ohio State's so concerned with stopping the receivers that, you know, the holes are just open. But it's interesting with Rourke. And I think, you know, if you look at Rourke's performance so far on the season, he hasn't had a 300-yard passing game since Northwestern. You know, since then, he threw for 189 yards versus Nebraska. Obviously, went out with the injury, didn't play against Washington, threw for 263, had 4 touchdowns against Michigan State, and only 206 yards, 2 touchdowns, and an interception against Michigan. You know, but and he's only had 3 300-yard games all year. You know, he had UCLA, Maryland, Northwestern, but he's still got 21 touchdowns, 4 interceptions, and a 72% completion percentage. But this feels like if Indiana's going to win, he's going to have to be dealing. He's going to have to be like spot on with his approach to throwing the ball. He's got to avoid the dumb interceptions. And it's interesting, like he's had so few, but all of them have stuck out so far this year in terms of they were throws that shouldn't have been made. The 2 at the beginning of the Maryland game, and then of course the 1 at the beginning of the second half against Michigan. We're just like, what? No, don't. What are you doing? Don't do that. He's had so few of those, but he can't afford any of them, I think, against Ohio State. You can get picked off by Ohio State, but it's got to be a good play by Ohio State. It can't be one where you just throw it somewhere where you're hoping that the ball gets in.
Yeah, and that's actually something we should talk about with Will Howard too, Ohio State's quarterback, because the one flaw against him in these big games is you look at the Oregon game and he played really well, man. Like everyone knows the slide at the end of the game. He got down a second or two, you know, too late, and Ohio State couldn't get off the game-winning kick. But he played really well in that game, and for stretches was probably the reason they were in that game. But like I said, at the end of the game, he had that slide a second too late. He also had a you know, just botched kind of a snap. I don't know if he just wasn't really looking at it when it was snapped late in that game on a 3rd down that, you know, resulted in a fumble that I believe Ohio State recovered it, but they had to punt because it was on 3rd down. And then in the Penn State game, he had the pick 6 early on. He had a run where he was about to score and it got punched out and fumbled out of the back of the end zone, goes back to the Penn State offense. And there's just been moments throughout other games at Michigan State. You know, Ohio State ends up blowing him out, but early in that game, he had a pick and a near pick in the end zone that kind of had you scratching your head. So he's had moments where he plays an A+ game for like 90% of it, but that 10% he just kind of has a mistake or two where you're scratching your head being like, man, what are you thinking? and that could be something that, you know, if IU can keep it tight like that could be something where maybe he makes a mistake late in the game and they can take advantage of it. So both quarterbacks, I think it's a very much a cliche, but when you're playing a top 5 matchup, when you're playing a game that should be close in the 4th quarter, the turnover battle is maybe going to be decisive.
Yeah.
And that's something that Indiana has to have on their side.
And it's worth noting, it's something Indiana has had on their side. Indiana's +10 in turnover margin this year. Ohio State's only +4. And I think what's been impressive about Indiana is they've come up with some really opportune turnovers in the last 3 games. You know, it was really what turned the tide early in the Washington game. And they were able to, you know, the fumble that they were able to force on Origi in the first half of the Michigan game was a big one. I mean, they've come up with those when they've needed them. So they're going to need them here. They cannot just trade punts and scores. They're going to have to force some changes in possession, and then they're going to have to take advantage of those, obviously, offensively. So, Steph, it's going to be fascinating. It's going to be a lot of fun. I will be over there, and I won't be completely freezing, it looks like now, based upon the weather forecast, but just going to be a scene. And I'm fascinated to see how it goes. You're going to have Big Noon there. You're going to have ESPN College Game Day there. You got the Big Ten Tailgate Show there. Like the entire college football landscape descending upon Columbus for Ohio State, Indiana. Who would have thought it at the beginning of the season?
It really is fascinating, man. And it's so cool. I remember, I'm sure a lot of people on the podcast know Gracie Barra, the TV reporter in St. Louis, who happens to be my girlfriend. And she went to, it was the Washington game, right?
Yeah, she went to the
Washington game. And I remember just talking to her being like, obviously I couldn't make it because I was working that Saturday. And I was just telling her, like, man, like I would give anything to be there. Like the biggest game in Indiana football history. And then about like a week or two later, like we were talking out, and she was like, I think the biggest game in Indiana football history might be a game that you are at. And I'm like, you know what? Yeah, because it's going to be in Columbus. So it's fascinating, man. There's so many aspects of this game that make it fun from an X's and O perspective. But the off the field kind of big picture stuff of like, it is the first top 5 matchup in Indiana football history. And it's just crazy to think how quickly it got here. Ross Dellinger earlier this week in an article referred to it as maybe the most impressive turnaround in college football history to go from what this program has been, not just historically, but think about how bad this team was last year, to be in the college football playoff conversation, to maybe be a win away from being the number 1 team in the country.
Yeah.
It's real.
It's wild. And I'm expecting you to bring the same luck that Grace brought with her when Indiana played Washington. All right. I'm going to hold.
It's a very equal task. Thank you.
I'm holding you to that right now. So anyway, well, look, this was fun. Enjoyed it. And we will obviously see you out in Columbus, and it's going to be a fascinating one. Indiana's got a chance here to do something that would be truly transformative. It's already been a transformative season for Indiana football in so many ways. And it's like when you say the sky's the limit, this is what they mean by that, because all that's above the sky is more sky. And the more sky right now is in Ohio Stadium on Saturday. Anyway, Steph, a joy as always. Great talking with you, and look forward to seeing what happens in this game. And we'll just see what goes on.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, man. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Stefan Krajisnik from Cleveland.com. Check him out. And we will be back with more Crimson Cast coming up soon as we continue to bring you through this magical season. Indiana 10-0 taking on Ohio State noon at the Horseshoe. For Stefan and for the entire Back Home Network, I'm Galen Clavio saying thanks for joining us here on Crimson Cast. We will catch you folks on the flip side. Bring back the Bison. Stay never daunted. So long, everybody. And goodbye.